Thank you, Lion Fred. I appreciate that nice introduction, and Mr. President and his lovely lady. I'm honored to be here tonight. I'm so glad to have the ladies here tonight. Oh, it's always nice to have them. They always add so much to a meeting. And just for you ladies, I want to share something with you. It's entitled The 7 Ages of Women. In her infancy, she needs love and care. In her childhood, she wants fun. In her teenage, she wants excitement. In her 20s, she wants romance. In her 30s, she wants admiration. In her 40s, she wants sympathy. But in her 50s, she wants cash.
Amen, brother.
Does anybody deny that? You know, they tell the story that when Al Smith was governor of New York many years ago, he had an occasion to visit Sing Sing prison for the first time, and after he'd been given a tour of the place, they asked him would he mind stepping into the auditorium and saying a few words to the inmates. So Governor Smith got up that morning and he said, "My fellow citizens." Well, that was his first mistake. He then realized that these people are not citizens, they're prisoners, so he corrected himself rather quickly and he said, "My fellow convicts." And that didn't bring on the needed response, so finally in desperation he said, "Well, anyhow, I'm glad to see so many of you here." Well, I am glad to see so many of you here. Incidentally, this is a free speech tonight, and when I get through, you'll know the price is right. I've been so busy lately, I had to pay a man to do my jogging for me. But you know, we're hearing so much night after night on the news about how bad it is in America and all the mistakes we've made. I sit there sometimes at night and I watch television and I'm just being told constantly how bad our country is, the free enterprise system and everything. No wonder people are depressed and taking tranquilizers. But thanks to a newspaper man out in San Francisco, Mr. Charles Gould, he came up with some statistics that I think will encourage you a little bit, because I'm one of those few people that believe there are more good things happening in America every day than there are bad. You just don't hear about it, but they're happening all over this country, and this is especially true with the young people in America. But Mr. Gould says that since all we hear about is crime and war and drug abuse, divorces, accidents, protest demonstrations and strikes and all the rest, he says that more than 196 million people were not arrested in this country. More than 89 million married persons did not file for divorce. More than 49 million students did not riot or try to burn down the university. More than 9 million young men did not burn their draft cards. More than 75 million citizens and corporations paid some 160 billion in income taxes. And more than 115 million people were formally affiliated with some religious group. Now, does that sound like everything is bad in America? And we still... You know, the great need of our time is energy, all right, but it's spiritual energy. As someone pointed out recently, the great need of our time is not so much the energy to light our homes and run our factories and propel our vehicles and so forth, but spiritual energy to light up the souls of people. One prominent man said recently, "It is my conviction that the energy crisis is a disease of the American backbone and can be cured by a large dose of American courage and patriotism and an old-fashioned revival that will put millions of Americans on their knees praying to God. The power of our Congress," he said, "the President, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Democratic and Republican parties, all our silver and all our gold combined, all this power is nothing compared to the power of the people of a nation on their knees praying to God and living for Him." And I might inject right now that that's what made America great. When our forefathers came to this country, they had a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. And they fought and they prayed and they fought and they prayed, and they carved out of a wilderness a great nation. And the concepts of our nation were based on a belief in God. The Supreme Court's ruled, I believe, on 6 different occasions this was a Christian nation. They didn't say everybody in it had to be a Christian, but people can worship God in their own way. And I think this is the main problem that we are having in our nation today, is when we've left God out of running the affairs of government. And this is true also in our schools. People are even comparing our nation to some of the other great civilizations, such as Rome. Ancient Rome and ancient Babylon, for example. But no civilization was ever conquered until it first decayed on the inside. Morality is an important issue today. And the flag and the Bible and the Constitution have remained vital and important down through the years because people have been willing to pay the price for their liberty and for their freedom. Tocqueville, the great French statesman, came to America in the 1800s, and he spent several weeks or several months over here. He went back home and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. And one of the things that impressed him was, he said, I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her fertile fields and boundless forests, but it was not there. I sought for it in her free schools and her institutions of learning, but it was not there. I sought for it in her matchless Constitution and democratic Congress. It was not there. Not until I went to the churches of America and found them aflame with righteousness did I understand the greatness and the genius of America. And what he was saying, in essence, is that America is great because America's good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. So you see, under all the fancy-sounding titles of the international conflict, it all boils down to two things: the battle between good and evil, and right and wrong. Now, our economics are a different situation these days, it seems. The government throws these figures around. It frightens me. They'll tell us something's going to cost $35 or $40 billion, like it doesn't really matter whether it's 35 or 40 billion. But you don't know what that does to a fellow that's been dyeing spaghetti black and using them for shoelaces. You know, we sold the Russians all of our wheat and immediately the price doubled, and then we sold them our soybeans and the price doubled. I have a great suggestion. Why don't we sell them some stocks? I'd like to see mine double tomorrow morning. And my wife's gotten real tricky about the food. I didn't know she was serving me horse meat until she laid a drumstick on the table that was 6 feet long. I heard a news release late this afternoon that claims the Russians have just launched the largest satellite in the space race. They've just sent up 12 head of cattle. And now they're boasting this is the first herd shot around the world. Well, y'all did pretty good. I tell that in the high school. Sometimes it takes 6 or 8 minutes before it begins to sink in. And then I know our kids are not getting as much history as they ought to be getting in this country. And from time to time we get reports in the media, of course, that the Russians are catching up to us with submarines and missiles and other weapons. Well, if the Russians are catching up to us, it's no wonder, really. You see, they don't have to spend half their time fighting communism, do they? Now, someone has recently said we're in for a recession. Now, you know what a recession is. That's when the fellow next door loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. But a panic is when your wife loses her job. And if the politicians keep on improving living conditions in our country, it's going to get to the point after a while that a great man can't even find a humble beginning. One fellow sent in his income tax return this year, and he put a little note down at the bottom, and he said, "Dear sir, I understand the president has declared war on poverty. Would you please tell me where I can go to surrender?" And one congressman said he got a note from a man in his district, and he said, "Please don't try to improve my lot in life any further. I just can't afford it." You know, I just found out recently what a government bureau is. That's where they keep the taxpayer's shirt. One businessman said he wanted his son to share in the business, but he said, you know, the government beat him to it. And did you know that George Washington was the only man that didn't have to blame the previous administration for all of his problems? But we'll always have two political parties in our country. They need each other for alibis. I was over at a big civic club in South Florida one day, and a fella got up and he says, you know, some politicians are sort of like cockroaches. He said, it ain't what they steal and carry home, it's what they fall into and mess up. And you know, the reason some congressmen are so anxious to get reelected is a lot of them know they couldn't make a living in private industry under some of the laws they passed while they were in Congress. Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it wrong, and applying unsuitable remedies. You know, when Mao Zedong first ran for office, they said he didn't have a Chinaman's chance. Now, there's nothing wrong with a political joke as long as you don't get elected. Will Rogers said one time, I'm not a member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat. And the Republican Party chairman asked his party leaders what he thought Republicans ought to do most, and a fellow jumped up and says, we need to multiply. Of course, the Democrats are going to have a great chance this year, I believe, but they'll probably spoil it by nominating somebody. We need another Will Rogers today, and I don't know what we're going to do about crime in the country. It's getting out of proportion, really. I heard a case where the man held up the bank teller in broad daylight and told him to put all that money in this bag, and the cashier looked at him and said, "Here, take the books to him, $5,000 short." One bank teller had been robbed 5 times, and the FBI man said, "Well, did you notice anything unusual about him?" Said, "Yes, every time he came in, he had on a better-looking suit." Well, I guess things are going to get better eventually. They always seem to do. Americans have always solved our problems, and I don't think we'll stop now. I'd like to share my philosophy with you. First of all, I believe in God, and I love America. And the national anthem thrills me every time I hear it, whether it's sung by a 5th grade class or played by the Marine Band in Washington. I've supported our men in Vietnam, and I'm not responsible for the guilt of all society. I do not believe the world owes me a living, and I have confidence in the younger generation. My favorite colors are red, white, and blue. And ladies and gentlemen, we live in the greatest country on the face of this earth, and don't you ever forget it for a minute or let anybody tell you any different. We are not perfect, nor do we claim to be, but tonight this is the only country in the world that has a waiting list of thousands who would do most anything if they could just get here. And very frankly, the way some people have abused their citizenship for the last several years, I'd like to swap them for some of these immigrants who'd like to come to America and make a contribution to the cause of freedom. Andrew Jackson said one time that Providence has showered on this land blessings without number, and he's chosen you to be the guardians of freedom, to protect it and preserve it for the benefit of the human race. Yes, Americanism does mean freedom. It means the freedom to speak without fear and the freedom to worship God in your own way, and the freedom to stand up for what you think is right, and the freedom to oppose that which you believe is wrong, and the freedom to elect those who govern your country. And as we approach our bicentennial, which means our nation will be 200 years old in 1976, I'm looking forward to this with great enthusiasm, because this will be the biggest birthday party we've ever had. And as most of you know, our company had just purchased some new locomotives about the time the President called on us to start planning the bicentennial, and one of them happened to be numbered 1776. And we named it the Spirit of 76, and it's the most beautiful red, white, and blue locomotive you've ever seen. It's been all over the country, and it creates excitement. For example, one of our good northern friends was down in Miami not long ago when she came through the railroad crossing, and he saw this beautiful red, white, and blue locomotive, and he got so excited he almost forgot to stop at the crossing. But he called the office to say what a beautiful sight it was. And I'm sure most of you here know how we decorate our building like the giant flag on the 4th of July by simply rearranging some lights in the building. And when night comes, you see the biggest American flag that's displayed anywhere in the United States. I never will forget the night I presented Johnny Cash a picture of our Spirit of 76, and Johnny looked at that train and he said 2 words: "It's beautiful." Well, we love Johnny, and we're proud of his love for trains and what he means to our country and how he made it back with the help of God and a good wife. Some time ago, a very prominent military man was telling the Rotary Club in a few observations he was making, in which he pointed out that if there's been a lack of patriotism in America in the last few years, don't blame it all on the Vietnam War. He pointed out that you can get degrees today from many of our largest colleges and universities across America after 4 years and never study one word of American history. He pointed out that 1 of 4 teachers' colleges today doesn't even require preliminary history at high school levels, and that 2/3 of our nation's colleges and universities today don't require any study of American history. We must teach our young people the stories of independence and the struggle that our ancestors made for it. Love of country and the stories of long ago should be implanted in our young people, very earliest age. History used to be taught in a way that it was remembered. It doesn't seem to be that way today. National Congress of Parents and Teachers Convention Speaker John Davis Lodge, on one occasion, former U.S. Ambassador to Spain and one-time Connecticut governor, said this, among other things: "We must decide now that our young people shall be taught that the greatest freedom is not the freedom from want, but the freedom to choose, the freedom to try, the freedom to compete, and yes, the freedom to fail. But most of all, the freedom to go just as far as your talents and your initiative will take you." If Patrick Henry had said, "Give me security or give me death," we wouldn't even remember him today. And Jesus said, "Seek and ye shall find." He didn't say, "Have a seat over there, friend, and I'll bring it to you." Ladies and gentlemen, we would do well to remember If it hadn't been for a man like Patrick Henry that stood one day in the Virginia Assembly and told those people in no uncertain terms that he didn't care what course they chose, but for me, give me liberty or give me death, we may never have had a nation. And what about John Hancock, who signed his name in big, bold letters on the Declaration of Independence? That took a lot of courage in those days, about as much as signing a mortgage today. If George Washington hadn't been willing to assume leadership of the Army of the Colonists, that whole cause might have failed. And Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and those others who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor paid the supreme price. President Theodore Roosevelt said on one occasion that patriotism means to stand by your country. That's what it means. Oh, it's great to be Democrats and it's great to be Republicans, but let me tell you, folks, it's great to be an American. And nobody in this country has been more thrilled at our POWs coming home than I am, except their families, because I'd been looking forward to it and was so gratified to hear their statements, one after the other. I've had the privilege of being on 3 convention programs with some of them, and I'll tell you, just to be on the same program and be around these men inspired me anew. To hear them stand up and tell that if it hadn't been for God, their country, and their families, they couldn't have made it. Many of them testified that they really knew now what freedom was and means and how precious it is. One colonel said that he got a letter from a little girl 6 years old, and she said, "My name is Susan. My front teeth are missing, and I'm very shy. But I'm so glad you're back home. God bless you." And the colonel said he'd like to tell Susan and all the little children in this world that each one of those men would be willing to go to prison again if it were necessary, if she or their country or their president ever needed them. Oh, that reminds me of that young man, Nathan Hale. You remember Nathan Hale? He was not even 22 years old when he was captured by the British for gathering information behind enemy lines. As he was about to be executed, they asked him if he had any last words he'd like to say. And very proudly he said he regretted that he only had one life to give for his country. And then a few years ago, they shot down a U-2 pilot for spying over Russia. When he was captured by the Russians, he cried like a baby and said he didn't know what he was doing, and if he had, he wouldn't have done it. You see the difference? How we've been going downhill with patriotism in the last few words. When I look at that beautiful flag, I think of the words of William McKinley, our 25th president, who said on one occasion, "We all love that flag. It gladdens the heart of the old and the young. And it doesn't make any difference where you raise that flag, whether it's on land or sea or here at home or maybe in a distant possession. It always stands for liberty and humanity. And whenever that flag is assaulted, the whole nation rises to defend it." Or Benjamin Harrison, our 23rd president, who suggested that the national flag float over every schoolhouse in America, and that the exercises in each one of those schools be such that will impress upon our youth the patriotic duties of American citizenship. Or Ben Franklin, who said liberty will not descend to a people must raise themselves to liberty. Or Daniel Webster, who said God grants liberty only to those who love it and those who are willing to guard and defend it. And that's what we've been doing ever since I can remember, is guarding and defending freedom throughout the world. Now, everybody wants peace. I've never known anybody that wanted war. But I also recall a man by the name of Hitler who said he wanted war, or wanted peace. But you see, the difference was he wanted a piece of that and a piece of this and a piece of that and a piece of this. And that's the reason that America has to remain strong, not only militarily, but spiritually and morally. I like to look back on some of these great battle cries of liberty that used to inspire men to give the ultimate to preserve liberty and freedom. You could start at the Alamo if you wanted to. People who love liberty and freedom more than life itself. Like John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, when they asked him to surrender, he said, "We've not yet begun to fight." Captain James Lawrence in 1813, when he told his men, "Don't give up the ship." And Colonel Bill Travis at the Alamo, when they asked him to surrender, he answered with a cannon shot and said, "We'll never surrender or retreat." And they didn't until they were overwhelmed by superior odds. And what about President Kennedy's oft-quoted statement, "Ask not what your country can do for you, what can you do for your country?" That's as fresh as tomorrow morning's headline. But a lot of Americans don't know that President Kennedy on one occasion told some Cubans in Miami, he said, "The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we'll never choose is a path of surrender or submission." Man, I like that. Like the story I heard during the Korean War. The soldiers one day at Choson Reservoir heard their commander get up and say, "Men, the enemy has us completely surrounded. We must not let them escape." And folks, that's the kind of patriotism we need in this country today, to stand up for America and stand up for freedom all over this world. Too many people today remind me of a cartoon I clipped out of the Wall Street Journal on one occasion. These two fellows were sitting at a bar having a drink, and one of them says, you know, if our government don't get down to brass tacks pretty soon, I'm going to start voting. Now, there are a lot of people in our country just like this. You can't get them out to vote. Why, they don't go to PTA meetings or civic club meetings. Why, they're so busy doing other things. 48 million Americans didn't bother to vote in one presidential election of not too long ago. 48 million people. And I wish every one of them could have stood in Miami Beach with me just a few years ago when a Cuban friend of mine stood there with tears streaming down his cheeks. He said, mister, if I could just vote for freedom one time, I'd get on my hands and knees and crawl 10 miles to the ballot box. I've lost it in my country. But if my country's ever free again, I can tell you one thing, I am going to get involved, and I'm going to vote, and I'm going to know who's running for office and get involved. I had breakfast with an 86-year-old man a few years ago at a watermelon convention. At breakfast, he told me in a very humble way how he came from Russia in 1928 and landed in New York City. He said, I got off the boat that day and I took a deep breath of free air. And he said the next thing I did was just to look at this magnificent country. He said, I felt so thankful and so humble just to be here. But he said, I didn't have but two $1 bills in my pocket, and I couldn't even speak English. And some people today still think they've got handicaps. I told him I'd hate to wind up in Russia tomorrow with 2 rubles in my pocket and couldn't speak Russian. This fellow's a millionaire many times over, but he never once decided to stand out on the corner with his hand out and let somebody help him. But like so many Americans ahead of him, he came to America looking for freedom and opportunity. And ladies and gentlemen, the freedom and opportunity is so prevalent in America today, we don't have enough people to take advantage of all the opportunities. I love to share freedom stories with these kids when I go to school. There's one especially that I like to tell about this beautiful Czechoslovakian family that I clipped out of the newspaper. These folks look like the people next door, across the street, or down on the corner. All they wanted was just to be free. That simple little word, freedom. Now, they didn't have to scale a wall or climb a barbed wire fence. All they had to do was get across an open field about as wide as a football field. If they could get to the other side, they'd be home free. And as the newspaper story accounts, there were 8 of them in the family. And the father took the smallest child, and one night, one afternoon about dusk, they drove down to this appointed place. And they got out of their car, and they started running across this field to freedom, just as fast as their legs would take them. When the Red soldiers patrolling the border saw this family running, they knew they were trying to escape. They didn't say, halt, come back. They just turned their machine guns on them as they ran and sprayed them with bullets. The family kept running. And finally, when they got to the other side, the father had been shot through the hand, the mother was shot through the leg, just a few other superficial wounds, but when they looked back, their little 12-year-old boy was lying out in the middle of that field. He'd been stricken down and so seriously wounded he couldn't continue. And they stood. They knew that they couldn't help him. They didn't know if he was dead or alive or how bad he was hurt, but they knew they couldn't render any aid. They would have all been killed or captured. And they stood there with tears in their eyes as the Red soldier walked out on the field and grabbed the little boy by the back of the neck and drug him back to the communist side and went back to marching their post as though nothing had happened. And ladies and gentlemen, except for the grace and the mercy of God, that could have been my little 12-year-old boy. It could be one of yours or one of your grandchildren someday. And if communism isn't so bad, nobody's ever been able to explain to me why they have to put barbed wire and machine guns there to keep people in a giant prison. Yes, our young people need to be told the story of freedom because in the early days of our country, the youth were on the front line for freedom. Patrick Henry was only 27 when he made his famous speech. Nathan Hale wasn't 22. Washington was a general in his 30s. Alexander Hamilton was a colonel at 19 and a general at 23. And Lafayette was a general at the age of 19. So you see, the young people are going to be leading this country in the future, and we need to have them well schooled in what we mean when we talk about the American way of life. I go to schools and challenge our young people to write essays on why I love America. I wish I had time to share some of them with you. They just thrill my heart every time I read them. And I get them every week. And I get as excited as the little boy that came in the room one day and his father was reading the newspaper. Printed in one section of the paper that day was a map of the world, and the father took a pair of scissors and he clipped out all the countries that day, and he gave them to his little boy, and he said, now, son, I want you to take all the pieces and go in the other room and put the world back together for your daddy. So the little boy went out of the room, and he came back in about 10 minutes, and he said, Daddy, I put the world back together. And his father said, "Son, that's impossible. How did you do it so quickly?" And he said, "Well, Daddy, I just turned the pieces on the back and I saw the picture of a man. So I just put the man back together and the world was right." And ladies and gentlemen, you see how simple it is, and they haven't figured that out in the United Nations yet. And people often say, "Well, why do you take time to go to elementary schools?" Well, I go there because I just love kids, and Art Linkletter loves them the same way. They say the cutest things. One little boy saw his daddy putting on his tuxedo one night, and he said, "Dad, don't wear that suit tonight. Every time you do, you have the worst headache the next day." Or the little boy that went to New York with his father, and he wanted to see the top of the Empire State Building. So they got on the elevator, and they pressed the button. The elevator sailed past the 70th floor, and the little boy looked up and said, "Daddy, do you think God knows we're coming?" Or the little boy that rushed in after school one afternoon all excited, and he said, "Guess what, Daddy? I learned to say yes, sir, and no, sir in school today." And his daddy said, "You did?" He said, "Yeah." Another little boy tiptoed in the house after school, and he said, "Dad, I'm supposed to tell you the minute I get home there'll be a small PTA meeting tomorrow night." And rather casually, his father said, "Well, now, son, don't bother me. If it's a small PTA meeting, I'm not even going." "Oh," he said, "Daddy, you've got to go. It's just going to be you and me and the principal." One little boy was asked if he knew where the Red Sea was, and he said, "Yes, it's the third line on my report card." One little boy sitting in algebra class, he couldn't solve a problem, and finally the professor said, "Son, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why, do you realize when George Washington was your age, he was a surveyor?" And the little boy said, "Yes, son, when he was your age, he was president of the United States." The reason I'm telling you this is these kids are real sharp, and don't you ever forget it. And they learn fast. And they need to be taught Americanism and patriotism and all the things our nation stands for from the earliest grades and earliest age. I always like to put in a plug for scouting when I go anywhere, because certainly this nation and this world needs leadership. And you know what a leader is. A leader is a person who's going places and he knows how to take people with him and has others enthusiastic about the cause and what he's working for. Leadership. We hear so much today about drugs, LSD this and LSD that. Well, let me tell you something. I picked up a magazine one day, and at the top of the page it said this: "LSD may be the answer." I looked at it and I read it again, and here's what it said. Have you tried the new LSD pills? Their ingredients are leadership, service, and dedication. They'll take you on a trip that will produce excitement, growth, and purpose and satisfaction. Your production will reach undreamed of highs. And the pills are habit forming. But a note of caution, you'll have to be your own pusher. Now that's the kind of LSD I want our kids excited about. Leadership, service, and dedication. Then you turn back to Boy Scouts. How many of you folks here tonight know that 65% of our Air Force Academy graduates were Boy Scouts, and 68% of our West Point graduates, 70% of the Annapolis graduates, and 72% of our Rhodes Scholars, 85% of our FBI agents, 26 of the first 29 astronauts, and the first man that ever set foot on the moon was a Boy Scout. And this doesn't count your team captains, your school editors, your class presidents, and you could go right down the line. Leadership. In fact, somebody told me that one of these groups of astronauts that went to the moon, one of them was the first Baptist that ever went to the moon. How about that? Of course, if you're a Methodist, that doesn't impress you. But I found out something else that was right interesting. Did you ever think about this? The initials of the first three men that ever lived on this earth, Adam, Abel, and Cain, had the same initials as the first three men that went to the moon, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. I don't know how significant that is for historical purposes, but ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you tonight that 100 years from now, it's not going to make a bit of difference what our bank account was, the kind of car we drove, or the kind of house we lived in. But this world might be a better place because one of us were important in the life of a boy or girl. I've done a number of Big Brother annual banquets, and I'm always thrilled to see how boys come out of their little shells when they have a man that'll give a few hours a week to help them get on the right track. And I think to help a young person is one of our great contributions. This develops leadership and self-confidence. And we need leadership, as I said. You know, Tom Edison didn't sit down and gripe about the darkness. He did something about it, didn't he? Salk didn't sit and gripe about polio. Ford didn't gripe about slow transportation. Pasteur didn't gripe about the lack of diphtheria. Carver didn't gripe about the lack of market for peanuts. Bell didn't sit down and complain about slow communications. And the Wright brothers didn't sit down and complain about gravity. No, each of these men could have copped out and simply complained and griped. Talking's always easier than hard work, you know. But instead of just loudly blaming the system, they solved many of the problems that have made life a lot easier for millions of Americans. And this took a lot of leadership. And of course, these men were winners. And I'm going to tell you right now how you can always recognize the difference between a winner and a loser. Nobody likes a loser. Everybody likes a winner. The winner usually says, let's find out. But the loser will say, nobody knows. When a winner makes a mistake, he says, I was wrong. When the loser makes a mistake, he'll say, well, it wasn't my fault. The winner goes through a problem. The loser tries to get around it, but you know he never gets past it. A winner makes commitments. A loser makes promises. The winner says, you know, I'm pretty good, but not as good as I ought to be. The loser says, well, I'm not bad as a lot of other people. A winner tries to learn from those who are superior to him. The loser tries to tear down those who are superior to him. And the winner says, you know, there ought to be a better way to do this. But the loser says, that's the way we've always done it. I hear it all the time. Walter Chrysler, the founder of the great Chrysler Corporation, said one time, the reason some people never succeed in this country is because when opportunity knocks on the front door, they're out in the backyard looking for four-leaf clovers. I don't have time to enumerate the men and women who've made it in America, people of all races, all walks of life. And the opportunities are here if they just want to try. The trouble today with kids coming out of college, they don't want to start at the bottom and work up. They want to go in as a vice president. Like one boy went down and applied for a job, and the boss said, son, you're asking a big salary just to begin. And the boy said, why, certainly, the job's a whole lot harder when you don't know nothing about it. But I could tell you about many people, starting with Abraham Lincoln, who started in the most dire circumstances, but they made a success because they had a desire to succeed. And nothing in this world can stop you from succeeding if you really want to succeed bad enough. You know, we hear so much today about our system and the Russian system. I want to give you a little quick picture of what we'd have to do in America right now to put our nation on a complete economic parity with the Soviet Union. In order to accomplish this, we'd have to abandon about 3/5 of our steel capacity, and then we would abandon 2/3 of our petroleum capacity, and we'd scrap 2 of every 3 of our hydroelectric plants. We'd eliminate 90% of the natural gas in this country, and we'd eliminate 95% of the electric output, and we'd rip up 14 of every 15 miles of our paved highways, and we'd destroy 2 of every 3 miles of our railroads, and then we'd sink 8 of every 9 ocean-going ships, and then we'd junk 19 of every 20 of our cars and trucks. You see, what bothers Russia is they got all the parking places, but we got all the automobiles. And then we'd slash our paychecks by 3/4 and our standard of living correspondingly. And then we'd transfer 60 million Americans back to the farm. And all our young people getting out of high school wouldn't be bothering whether to pursue a course or not. This is predetermined by the government. Most of them are sent to work on the farm, and they can't grow enough food to feed their own people. The next thing we'd do is destroy 40 million television sets. And that's the best news I've heard. Why, can you visualize what it would be like in this country to not have television for a whole year? Why, there's some people in this country who would find out what their neighbor's name is next door and across the street. Why, they've been so busy watching I Love Lucy, Wagon Train, and Gunsmoke, they forgot to even have neighbors. One boy was 9 years old. He never heard his family say a word in the living room. All he'd ever heard was, shh. The next thing we do is rip out 9 of every 10 telephones and tear down 7 of every 10 houses that now stand. It's wonderful, that wall they built around Berlin to keep us out. I haven't heard of a soul being shot trying to climb into Russia or East Berlin or Cuba. No tunnels are being dug from the free world into these places, ladies and gentlemen, but there are a lot of tunnels being dug by people trying to get out. Let me tell you how great it is in America, and I want you to remember this. We're only 6% of this world's population. We don't occupy but 7% of the land surface on this earth. But we own 71% of the world's automobiles and 56% of the telephones, 50% of the radios and 29% of the railroads, 83% of all the television sets in the world, and we own 90% of all the bathtubs in the world. It's a shame more of them are not being used. Like the 2 fellows going up on the elevator one day, and one of them says, hey, mister, one of us's deodorant don't work. And this fellow said, well, it must be you. I don't use it. This country produces 59% of the world's steel and 46% of the world's electric power and 50% of the oil, 56% of the corn and 42% of the cotton and 33% of the coal, 31% of the copper and 38% of the iron. 44% of all the manufactured goods on the face of this earth are produced by only 6% of the world's population. And we got a bunch of misguided people running all over this country telling your kids and mine that our free enterprise system is out of date and they want to change it. Don't you ever let them vote socialism into this country. You haven't had any problems yet. A fellow by the name of Robert Murphy, a former diplomat and a former Undersecretary of State, said this, quote, "Only by fostering private enterprise can the United States truly capitalize on its most basic advantage over communism." Another fellow from England by the name of Winston Churchill said this, "Socialism is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." These people who are always running down our country and God and our family remind me of the boy that murdered his mother and father and then threw himself on the mercy of the court because he was an orphan. Why, I even heard about a liberal church that put a big sign out front one day that said, "There ain't no hell." And a little fundamental church across the street put out a sign twice as big that said, "The hell there ain't." But ladies and gentlemen, we've got a great country, and we've got a great future, and I'm optimistic. And I say this because I have been in schools and worked with young people all across the country, and I've been with people just like you. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely convinced that unless we have a spiritual revival in America, and unless we have a cleanup of morality in this country, and start standing up for what we believe to be right, and unless we rededicate ourselves to the ideals that our founding fathers had, the day may come when you're sitting on your front porch rocking back and forth, telling your precious grandchildren how it used to be when you lived in a free America. And I want to thank you for the privilege of letting me come here tonight to stand up and give 3 cheers for God and our wonderful country. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you very much.